Hello, I'm David Stephen Cohen. This is a talk I originally delivered in 1992 at Bard College, retitled The Significance of Ethnicity in American History. It seems to me to be still relevant today. The end of centuries tend to be a time of summing up. It was in 1893 at the World's Congress of Historians held in conjunction with the Columbian Exposition in Chicago that historian Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his seminal essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. He began by citing the announcement in 1890 by the Superintendent of the United States Census of the official closing of the American frontier. Turner's essay crystallized a recurrent theme in American thought, that American culture was the product of the frontier. His frontier thesis influenced generations of historians that followed. Today, much of the frontier thesis has been refuted, and the advent of the new social history, women's history, and ethnic history has fragmented historical thinking. No longer is there a synthesis in American history, which the frontier thesis at least had provided, although there may well be a synthesis implicit in these new approaches. Any attempt to create a new synthesis would have to involve the significance of ethnicity in American history. In 1992, the nation celebrated the quincentennial of Columbus's arrival in America. Overshadowed by this celebration was another anniversary, the opening in 1892 of the federal immigration station on Ellis Island. All commemorations are symbolic, and historical analysis based on commemorative observances can be misleading rather than illuminating. It is all too easy, and perhaps misguided, to suggest that the closing of the American frontier and the opening of Ellis Island were in any way related, or that they represent a turning point in American history. Ethnicity has been an important factor from the beginning. In a sense, ethnicity is a better explanation than the frontier of the shaping of American culture. The frontier, conceived either as a line moving westward or as an area of supposed free land, is ethnocentric to a fault. It is limited to an Anglo-American perspective on history. The frontier may be more accurately seen as a place where Europeans, African Americans, and Native Americans came in contact in the Americas. Many of the cultural traits associated with the frontier were in fact ethnic culture traits. 3 examples are the log cabin, the covered wagon, and the cowboy. Research by folklorists and cultural geographers have shown that the log cabin was not an indigenous product of the American frontier. It was a merging of Scandinavian and German log construction techniques with English and Scotch-Irish floor plans. First introduced in the Delaware Valley, log construction diffused through the Appalachian Mountains into the Trans-Appalachian West, following the routes of migration. The covered wagon, or Conestoga wagon as it was sometimes called, is derived from Northern European freight and farm wagons found in Western Germany and the Netherlands. The English adopted these wagons from the Dutch. Thus, there were German, Dutch, and English prototypes for these wagons that became the famed prairie schooners of the American West. The cowboy was in fact an Anglo-American product of cattle ranching techniques introduced to the Americas by the Spaniards. The cowboy was known by different names in different countries: the gaucho in Argentina, the llanero in the western Venezuela and eastern Colombia, and the vaquero of Mexico. But they were all part of the same Spanish cattle ranching complex. Instead of viewing the settling of North America as in ethnocentric terms of the Western migration of English-speaking people, The frontier may be better visualized as the boundary between settlements of several European ethnic groups, the French in Canada, the Spaniards in New Spain, the Dutch in New Netherland, the Swedes in New Sweden, the English in the British colonies, as well as several Native American cultural groups, such as the Eastern Woodland, the Southeastern, the Plains, the Southwestern, the Pacific Northwestern tribes, and several West African cultural groups, among them the Yoruba, Congo, Dahomean, and Mande. The interaction among these peoples resulted, in the words of the environmental historian Andrew W. Crosby, as the Columbian Exchange that reshaped the diet, the language, the music, the dance, not just of America, but of the world. Before proceedings, we might distinguish between immigration and ethnicity. Immigration is one of the several ways that an ethnic group comes to reside in a particular place. It refers to the voluntary act of leaving one country of birth and moving to another to live and work. The immigration model, however, does not apply to most African Americans and Native Americans, with the exception of those people of African ancestry who have immigrated from South America, the Caribbean, or Africa, whom the census incidentally lists simply as Black but not African American. Most African Americans were brought to America involuntarily as slaves. Native Americans, of course, were here when the first Europeans arrived. The current theory is that their ancestors migrated from Asia to America about 15,000 years ago across a land bridge that once spanned the Bering Strait. Thus, Native Americans example two other ways in which ethnic groups have come into existence, that is, by migration and by conquest. There are those that argue that African Americans and Native Americans should not be considered ethnic groups, but racial groups. Though through the 1930s, sociologists continued to use the terms race and immigrant synonymously. It wasn't until World War II, in reaction to Nazi racial theories about the so-called Aryan master race, that scholars began to distinguish between race, linguistic group, and ethnic group. The Harvard Encyclopedia of Ethnic Group includes within its definition of ethnicity regional groups, such as the Southern Appalachian Mountain People, Southerners, and Yankees, as well as religious groups, such as the Jews, Eastern Catholics, Mormons, and Muslims. I would argue that race, language, religion, and region may help define an ethnic group, but they are not the same as ethnicity. Blacks may be African American, Afro-Cuban, Jamaican, or Haitian. Jews may be Sephardic or Ashkenazic. Hispanics may be Cuban, Colombian, Dominican, or Puerto Rican, and so on. Ethnicity is dynamic. Ethnic identities emerge and change. Immigrants become ethnics, a process which is manifested in the emergence of a sense of group identity. Many 19th century immigrants identified with the town or region from which they came, not the country. In fact, the country may not have existed when they left. The Poles identified with Warsaw or Galicia, Italians with Sicily or Naples, the Germans with Hanover or Bavaria. Once they settled in America, the group identity emerged. For some, like the Ukrainians, the name of the ethnic group did not even exist until the 20th century. Previous, they were known as Ruthenians or Little Russians, a term they dislike today. Often, identity that emerges in this country was a composite of traits from different regions of the old country. For example, the Ukrainian-American ethnic identity combines wood-carving traditions from the Carpathian Mountains, the music and dance tradition of the Cossacks, the embroidery and costumes of the eastern province of Poltava. My own research on the Dutch in New Netherlands indicated that more than half their ancestors were not even from the Netherlands. They became culturally Dutch because this was the dominant culture of the region. And my work on the Ramapo Mountain people shows that a group that originated as free blacks who were culturally Dutch is in the process of becoming recognized by their neighbors and newspapers, if not the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as an Indian tribe. The problem of defining ethnicity is complicated by changes in the accepted meaning of the word. The term ethnic is derived from the Greek word ethnos, which means nation or race. From the Middle Ages through the 18th century, the English word was used to mean pertaining to nations not Christian or Jewish, or Gentile, heathen, or pagan. In other words, ethnic meant foreigners, them, not us. This usage continued into the 20th century. In the classic 1941 to 1945 study of immigrants in Newburyport, Massachusetts, titled Yankee City, sociologist William Lloyd Warner described an ethnic as, quote, any individual who considers himself or is considered to be a member of a group with a foreign culture and who participates in the activities of that group, unquote. The argument that immigrants should not be considered foreigners can be traced back to Walt Whitman's statement that America is, quote, a nation of nations. This notion that all Americans are ethnics is related to the concept of cultural pluralism, a term coined by the Jewish American philosopher Horace M. Kallen in the 1920s and popularized by the Slovenian American writer Louis Adamic in the 1930s. Rather than distinguishing between foreigners and true Americans, the proponents of cultural pluralism suggested that everyone who came to settle in America was an American. In the late 1930s, cultural pluralism became part of the official ideology of the New Deal, which found expression in New Deal cultural programs, especially the WPA Federal Writers Project. From the late 1940s through the 1960s, conformity eclipsed diversity. Cultural pluralism came into vogue again during the ethnic revival of the 1970s and 1980s, which had seen renewed interest in tracing one's ethnic roots. The growing of multicultural and bilingual programs in secondary schools and ethnic studies programs in colleges, as well as the revival of ethnic cultures as expressed in ethnic festivals. Yet there is a basic difference between the cultural pluralism of the 1920s and the 1930s, which was a reaction to the nativism that lay behind the immigration restrictions in the 1920s, and the ethnic revival of the 1970s and 80s, which was a reaction to the Black Pride movement of the 1960s. Cultural pluralism was based on an ideal of ethnic harmony, while the ethnic revival of recent years has undercurrents of ethnic conflict as each group promotes its own political agenda: bilingual education, Afrocentrism, Native American rights, Holocaust studies. This is not to say that ethnic conflict and ethnic politics did not exist until the ethnic revival. On the contrary, the emergence of Irish and Polish ethnic identity in America was integrally linked to the desire of the Irish and Polish Americans to promote national independence for their homelands. Some historians and sociologists see ethnic groups as subcultures within a predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. They use the term ethnic to mean minority, as distinct from a vague construct called mainstream American culture. While it's true there is a popular culture that cuts across regional, class, racial, religious, and ethnic divisions, this popular culture is not necessarily the culture of any single ethnic group. even though certain individuals and groups have tried to define America culture in terms of their own region, class, religion, or ethnic group. The frontier thesis may be considered Frederick Jackson Turner's effort to define America in terms of the region from which he came, that is, the Midwest, or the frontier of Wisconsin. It has been customary to refer to the United States as predominantly WASP, because the American institutions were derived from our experience as British colonies. Historian David Fisher argues that the population of the United States in 1790 was predominantly British. There are two problems with this notion. First, it is derived from total white population, excluding African Americans, who constituted 19.3% of the population in 1790. Second, it presumes that the English, the Scots, and the Irish were a single ethnic group. When you factor out the non-English people who came from the British Isles, but who had different languages and cultures, the English population of the United States in 1790 was only about 49.2% of the population, including African Americans. Thus, the English were the largest single ethnic group as compared to African Americans with 19.3%, Irish, both Ulster and Erie, 7.8%, Germans, 7%, Scots, 6.6%, and the Dutch, 2.6%. But they were a plurality rather than a majority of the total population. Some scholars persist in distinguishing between old immigrants, that is, the Irish, Germans, and Chinese who came to the United States in great numbers between 1840 and 1880, and the new immigrants, the Eastern and Southern Europeans who came between 1880 and 1930. There are several problems with this periodization, but most notably is what constitutes new immigration. The term that immigration ended in 1930 as new may have made sense at one time, but certainly not today. Furthermore, the period since World War II has seen a new wave of immigration from different parts of the world. Immigrants who have come since the Immigration Act of 1965 may be the real new immigrants, but so may those who have come since 1980, which represents a shift in the countries of origin. The problem will not go away as long as the term of old and new immigration are used. I would like to suggest a different periodization, one not based solely on immigration, but one which deals with the peopling, not just of North America, but not just of British North America, but of North America in general. I suggest four major periods. One, the pre-Columbian migration of the ancestors of Native Americans across the Bering Straits and their dispersal throughout North America. Two, the migration of Europeans and Africans, mostly as indentured servants and slaves, during the colonial period from about 1500 to the end of the slave trade in the United States in 1808. Three, the period between 1820 and 1930, during which European immigrants were attracted to the United States by the related developments of industrialization and urbanization. And four, the period between World War II and the present, during which suburbanization and a post-industrial economy combined with a shift in immigration sources after 1965 to Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. The total Native American population at the time of contact with Europeans around 1500 was about 90 to 112 million in the Western Hemisphere, of which about 10 to 12 million lived in North America. They were divided into different language groups, Algonquian, Iroquoian, Siouan, and different culture areas. areas: eastern woodlands, southeastern plains, southwestern and Pacific Northwest. Unlike major populations that settled North America after contact with Europeans, the population of Native Americans decreased drastically as a result of war and disease until it reached a low point in 1930, when the Native American population of North America was estimated to be about 490,000. The most recent figures for the total Indian population today, according to the 1990 census, is 1.8 million. Although this figure may be a bit suspect because since 1980, the United States Census has relied on self-attribution of ethnic and racial identity. And there are a number of groups in New Jersey and elsewhere throughout the United States that claim Indian identity but cannot prove more than a minimal ancestry, if that. It is not surprising that between 1980 and 1990, the number of people claiming Indian identity in New Jersey increased 78.3% from 8,394 to 14,970. The subsequent migrations to America from Africa and Europe overwhelmed the declining population of Native Americans. In what historians Bernard Bailyn has called one of the greatest events in recorded history, an estimated 50 million people came to North America between 1500 and the present. During the 17th century, more than 378 immigrants left England for the Western Hemisphere, of whom 155,000 came to North America. Most of them were indentured servants who were recruited because of chronic labor shortage that existed in colonial America. The other solution to the labor shortage, besides indentured servitude, was slavery. Between 1500 and 1870, approximately 11 million Africans were forcibly brought to America through the Atlantic slave trade, of whom about 500,000 were brought to British North America until the close of the slave trade in the United States in 1808. The end of the importation of slaves to the United States in 1808 marked the close of the second period of immigration and the beginning of the third. The third period saw the replacement of indentured and slave labor with industrial and urban workforce. In 1790, only 5.1% of the population of the United States was urban. By 1920, 51.2% was urban. The percentage was even higher in the Northeast. By 1880, 50.8% of the total population of this region was urban, and by 1920, the urban population in the Northeast had risen to 75.5%. These great industrial cities were truly immigrant cities. In 1910, first and second generation immigrants comprised 78% of the population of New York City, 77% of Chicago, and 74% of Boston. Not only were there changes from rural to urban residents, there was also a change in the workforce. In 1800, 73.7% of the total workforce in the United States were involved in farming. By 1910, farm work constituted only 30.9% of the civilian workforce, while white-collar workers were 21.4%, and manual and service workers, that is factory and domestic workers, constituted 48.2%. This last category was the one in which most immigrants found jobs. The number of people who immigrated during this third period was phenomenal. Between 1820 and 1930, almost 38 million immigrants came to the United States, almost 10 times the number of people who lived in the United States in 1790. During the peak decade between 1901 and 1910, 8.8 million arrived, a number that was not matched either before or since. 92% of the immigration between 1821 and 1930 was from Europe. The period between 1821 and 1880, 57.8% came from either Ireland or Germany. For the period between 1881 and 1930, only about 47.5% of the total population of immigrants came from Eastern and Southern Europe. But for the peak decade between 1900 and 1910, approximately 68.8% came from Eastern and Southern Europe. A large number of these immigrants eventually returned to their homelands. The return rate varied from ethnic group to ethnic group, but 87.4% of Bulgarian, Montenegros, and Serbians, 66.1% of Romanians, 53.7% of Greeks, 45.6% of Italians, and 43.3% of Jews. This period of mass immigration was brought to a close in the 1920s by a series of laws that established quotas restricting the number of Eastern and Southern Europeans, followed by the discouraging economic conditions of the Great Depression. During the period from 1931 to 1940, only about 528,000 immigrants came to the United States. The period since the end of World War II saw a major shift in population from cities to suburbs, a decline in heavy industry, and a shift in places of origin of immigrants. Beginning in 1950, the United States Census began to enumerate the population in which they termed standard metropolitan areas, which were later renamed standard metropolitan statistic areas. These were defined as a county or group of contiguous counties that contained at least one city with a population of 50,000 or more, and that was socially and economically integrated. The standard metropolitan statistic area differed from urbanized areas in the former, in that the former were not built up throughout and might contain rural areas in the close proximity to developed areas. The shift in population from urban to suburban is reflected in the fact that in 1950 there were only 14 standard metropolitan areas containing less than 30% of the total population of the United States. But by 1990 there were 39 standard metropolitan statistical areas, which contained just over half, that is 50.2% of the nation's population. At the same time, there was a decrease in the percentage of workforce involved in manufacturing. In 1988, 69.7% of the civilian workforce was classified as managerial, professional, technical, scale, sales, service, or administrative support. 27.4% as precision, production, craft, repair, operators, fabricators, and laborers, and only 3% as farming, forestry, and fishing. As the flow of immigration was resumed after World War II, preferential treatment was given to refugees, first from displaced person camps in Europe, and then from the 1950s to the 1980s to refugees from communist countries such as Hungary, Cuba, and Vietnam. In 1965, the United States passed a major revision in its immigration laws, altering the previous quota system, thereby opening the door to non-European immigrants. At the same time, it gave preferential treatment to certain skilled workers needed in a post-industrial economy. The shift became evident in the immigration statistics. Between 1941 and 1988, about 16 million immigrants came to the United States. Almost half of those who came between 1941 and 1965, that is 49.5%, came from Europe, but an increasing portion came from Latin America and the Caribbean, that is 25%. Only 5.2% came from Asia. In the decade from 1971 to 1980, only about 18% of the total immigrants came from Europe. The percentage from Latin America and the Caribbean increased to 34%, and there was a dramatic increase to 36% from Asia, and the trend has continued. According to the 1990 census, Asians are the fastest growing immigrant group in the country, having increased by 108% between 1980 and 1990, followed by Hispanics, who increased 53% during the same period. Ethnicity has had an important impact on local, regional, and national levels of American culture and society. The ethnic neighborhood is one of the most visible signs of ethnicity in America, as was noted by Robert E. Park, his students and colleagues at the University of Chicago in the 1920s. They noted that immigrants in Chicago tended to cluster together in colonies or ghettos, which were segregated residential enclaves. These ethnic neighborhoods underwent a process that the University of Chicago sociologist terms secession, as more recent immigrants replaced the earlier immigrant groups. However, as historian Hubert S. Nelly has shown, despite the high visibility of one ethnic group in these neighborhoods, rarely was the ethnic group the residence of a single ethnic group, nor did a single ethnic group even constitute a majority of the population. Often, remnants of the early immigrant groups remained in the neighborhood. One of the largest ethnic groups composed a plurality of the population and stamped its identity on the neighborhood. One major exception to this pattern is among African Americans. For them, residential segregation in northern urban neighborhoods has been increasingly progressively. In the city of Newark in 1850, blacks constituted only 5% of the population of the Third Ward. By 1940, in the midst of the Great Migration of African Americans from the south to northern cities, which commenced during World War I, blacks constituted 63.2% of the population of the Third Ward of Newark. But in 1980 census, in 15 of Newark's census tracts, blacks constituted 75% or more of the population, and 7 census tracts, they were 90% or more of the total population. The unprecedented degree of urban residential segregation is unmatched by any other ethnic group, including Hispanics. Not only are there ethnic group clusters within cities, different cities have different ethnic makeups, which is one of the factors that has given these cities their distinctive identities. For example, the largest foreign-born population in Milwaukee in 1920 was German. In Boston, it was Irish, and in New York, it was Russian and Lithuanian, approximately 80% of which was Jewish. Thus, the association of Boston with the Irish, Milwaukee with the Germans, and New York with the Jews has some basis in the distribution of the ethnic populations. But ethnicity is not solely an urban phenomena. One of the lesser explored dimensions of American ethnicity has been rural ethnicity. In 1911, the report of the United States Senate Immigration Commission on Recent Immigrants in Agriculture noted that in 1900, 21.7% of all foreign breadwinners were in agriculture. The largest number of foreign-born farmers were Germans, but there were also Norwegians, Swedes, Italians, Poles, Portuguese, Bohemians, and Japanese. In New Jersey, there was a significant South Jersey agricultural population of Germans, Italians, and Eastern European Jews. Many Italians continue to be engaged in agriculture in South New Jersey. Contrary to the position of some sociologists, such as Herman J. Gans and Will Herberg, who argued in the 1950s and 60s that class or religious identities eclipsed ethnic identities in the suburbs, the overall pattern has emerged since the 1960s that clearly shows ethnicity continues strong in suburbia. In 1980, the census shows that, like urban ethnic neighborhoods, certain suburban communities have become associated with particular ethnic groups. For example, in New Jersey, the largest suburban concentration of Italians is in Belleville, a suburb of Newark, where the people of Italian and Italian mixed ancestry with some other ancestry constitutes 52% of the total population. The largest suburban population of Poles was in South River, with the total Polish and Polish mixed with other ancestry constituted 31% of the population. In the New Jersey Shore resort community of Spring Lake, Irish and Irish mixed with other ancestries constituted 48.3%. Middle-class blacks also moved out of the inner cities into the suburbs. The largest suburban black population in 1990 in New Jersey, it was in Plainfield, where they constituted 62% of the total population 18 years or older. In the post-World War II suburban community of Willingsboro, which was the Levittown studied by Herbert Gans, blacks constitute 52.4% of the 18 or older population in 1990. The different distribution of ethnic groups has also influenced regional identities. In 1860, 2/3 of the Irish in the United States lived in New England or the Mid-Atlantic states. Most cities and about half the Germans in the country lived in the Midwest, mainly on farms. In 1980, the census showed 79% of the Poles lived in the Northeast and Midwest, in what some people have termed the polka belt. 53% of African Americans lived in the South, 77% of the Japanese in the West, and 73% of Puerto Ricans in the Northeast. On the national level, changes in the sources of immigration have changed the overall makeup of the American population. According to the 1990 census, the total population of the United States was 248.7 million. Of this, 12.1% were listed themselves as Black, 9% as Hispanic, 2.9% as Asian and Pacific Islander, and 0.8% as American Indian. Thus, Hispanics are quickly challenging blacks as the largest minority group, and American pluralism continues to mean that no ethnic group constitutes more than a plurality of the population. To those who argue that ethnicity undermines the national culture of the United States, I would note that many of our so-called national cultural traits are originally ethnic culture. I originally mentioned the log cabin, the covered wagon, and the cowboy, all of which have ethnic origins. Many of the foods we think of as American have ethnic origins. Consider such Native American foods as corn or maize, the tomato, and chili peppers. The German sausage, which became the American hot dog, the Italian pizza, the Jewish bagel, the Mexican taco, all of which have become typically American and have measured by their appearance on the menus of franchise restaurants around the country. The American language, which is the spoken word as opposed to the artificial construct term Standard English, has incorporated words and expressions from a variety of languages spoken by American ethnic groups. Consider such African American expressions as boogie woogie, jive, jazz, rock and roll, rap, the Dutch stoop, cookery, and hook for point of land, the Spanish vamos, calaboose, buckaroo from vaquero, the German kindergarten, delicatessen, and nix for veto, and the Chinese kowtow, the Yiddish klutz, and so on. American music has also been shaped by ethnic traditions, from the African American blues and spirituals to the Scotch-Irish ballads and fiddle tunes, which together represent the twin foundation heads of American folk and popular music. To this mix has been added Cajun, Tex-Mex, polka, salsa, and Zydeco music. Similarly, dance in America has been invigorated by African American buck dancing, Celtic American step dancing, which is the grandparent of American square dancing and clog dancing, as well as numerous dance traditions that have come from Latin America, such as tango, samba, mambo, cha-cha-cha, conga. And finally, let us not forget the many ethnic festivals, including both the single group festivals like St. Patrick's Day, which is celebrated by Irish and non-Irish alike, and the currently ubiquitous multi-ethnic festivals that have become so popular since the ethnic revival in the 1970s. Clearly, ethnic traditions continue to thrive in American folk culture, as well as being a shaping factor in the popular culture, which after all is the American national culture. I am not suggesting that ethnicity is the only or even the most important factor in American history. It is only one factor, along with race, class, religion, gender, and region, all of which are related to ethnicity yet are independent from it. Certain topics in American history, such as the Civil War, for example, may best be explained by factors other than ethnicity, such as race or religion or region or constitutional issues. There are those today who disapprove of ethnic diversity or multicultural in its most recent manifestation. Whatever one calls it, and whether or not one approves of it, ethnicity is a fact of life in America and has been so from the beginning. But what is the future of ethnicity in America? As the war enters a post-world Cold War era, the ethnic conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Mideast seem to be tearing nations apart. What will become the effect of ethnic diversity in America? I do not adhere to the Pollyanna view of the cultural pluralists who think that all one has to do is attend a multi-ethnic festival or eat ethnic food of another ethnic group and everyone will get along with each other. There has been too much ethnic conflict in the United States to think that ethnicity has always been a force for peace and understanding. However, what makes ethnicity in the United States different than in some other countries is that no one ethnic group constitutes more than a plurality of the total population. This is not to say that there hasn't been domination in American history, such as the white race over African Americans and Native Americans, or Europeans over non-Europeans, or men over women. In the last analysis, however, James Madison's insight about American government applies to American ethnicity, namely that this nation is sufficiently large and sufficiently diverse that no one faction or ethnic group has dominated all the time. To rephrase Madison's dictum, in America we behold a pluralistic remedy for the diseases most incident to a pluralistic society.